Hello, it's Lorna and it's Mixed Media Monday. And for this Mixed Media Monday, I have created a watercolor and oil pastel painting. So I'm using mixed media paper for this. You could alternatively use watercolor paper. I am using mixed media paper because I find that it works best for watercolor and for oil pastels. Because it doesn't have as much texture that I don't really like to show underneath the oil pastels. So I'm just using these oil pastels. These are Artist Loft. And I have them arranged differently from what the manufacturer arranges them. And I like to set up my palettes, if you will, according to the colors that I use together. I don't necessarily stick to rainbow colors, just necessarily warm, cool, or different shades. Specifically with things like watercolor and pastel, you'll note that I set them up based on their tone so that my pinks are with my pinks and my blacks are with my blacks, because sometimes the darker purples look like black in the pan. So these watercolors that I have here, you can see they're very similarly set up to my pastels. Did not plan for that, but it is how I set up most of my things. These watercolors, I'm not sure what brand they are. I believe they're Master Touch, could be wrong. I have some brushes. Sometimes you can use watercolors. These are really inexpensive as well from Walmart. And I'm going to show you chalk pastels and oil pastels. I'm not going to be using chalk pastels, but I want to show you a quick comparison of their difference. So I'm going to rub both of them on the paper and show you how they blend. The reason why I'm using oil pastels today and not chalk pastels is because the oil component in the pastels that I'll be using today are what are going to resist against the watercolor. If I use chalk pastels, I would want to use that after I've used my watercolor, because the watercolor will wash away the chalk pastels. You can actually paint with chalk pastels as well. So you can crush it up and use it with water to make a paste and paint with it. So I'm just taking a piece of paper towel. You can use toilet paper or tissue paper or like facial tissue and Kleenex to rub them out. So there's so many different kinds of watercolor as well. You could use a liquid watercolor. You could use a gouache for this. That might be a little bit too heavy. It might actually go over the watercolor, or not the watercolor, the oil pastel. So I would recommend just using liquid watercolor or these watercolor cakes. So I have my paper taped down. I like to tape down anything that I'm going to be watercoloring because the water can warp the paper. If you don't have tape, you can always press down the paper afterwards. You can press it down with some heavy books, and that works quite well. So I'm taking my black and I'm just doing some lines. So the scene that I'm making, I showed you at the beginning, it's just going to be some kind of reeds or grass, like tall grass. I'm imagining these fluffy grass. I don't know what they're called. It's not cattails. It's not anything like that. There's these like, I don't know, they were at Sac State when I was a kid. I don't know what they're called. But I'm just drawing some plants, some organic matter, and it's going to be silhouetted for the most part. I am going to get some slight texture with these oil pastels, so you'll see a little bit of detail, but not much. And I'm just shading it in here. So I'm doing a rough sketch of where I want my grass to go, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to add more details. You can sharpen the point of your oil pastels with a blade very carefully if you wanted it to get to a point, or you could rub it into a finer point on a piece of paper. I recommend having a scrap piece of paper that is the same type of paper that you're using, so that you can test these things out. So you can test out the sharpness of your pastel, the color of your pastel. Like I said before, sometimes these pastels can be very sneaky and you'll think you'll have a black pastel, but it's actually a navy blue. So I like to have a piece of paper next to me just so I can be sure that I'm not about to make some navy blue grass and I'm actually using black, which is what I want. So I'm just going in and I'm making like the fluffy, feathery part of my grass at the tops, because I just want it to look like the viewer is standing really close, like in the grass, and then off in the distance there's going to be this beautiful sunset with water and some little like hills and mountains and a really nice sky. So I am making these look larger than life, really close. Kind of reminds me of the Casumnes Preserve, and I lived over there when I was a teenager, so it was kind of nice to be able to see this little pond with all of these grass things. I don't know what they're called. So I'm just doing some line shaping, and I'm actually going to do some line shaping with watercolor as well. This type of painting you could do fully with oil pastel, or you could do it with watercolor. I'm showing you with my really heavy darks and putting my dark pastels in currently, because I want to show you how well the watercolor resists to the oil pastels. With a lot of mediums, if you went with a light yellow over this black, it would bleed together and be a mess. But with oil pastels and watercolor, you don't get any mixing, and it's really nice. So I'm just softening those edges with my paper. I like to fold my paper into a point so I have a little more accuracy. And then I'll use the same paper over and over, but I will rotate it around and make a new point if my point starts to soften, because it's a napkin I'm using. So I want these to be very soft and wispy, because that's what I remember these kinds of plants being. But if you were to do some cattails or just regular grass, like or some flowers or something like that, you would want to have cleaner lines and more detail. You could also go in afterwards with a Fineliner. You just want to test your Fineliner to make sure that it's not water soluble if you're going in wet. And you also want to test your Fineliner to make sure that it will go over the oil pastels without getting all gummed up. Because sometimes if you take your really nice like micron pen and you go over oil pastels, you'll ruin the felt tip on your micron pen. So something to think about is that oil pastels do not dry down. They will stay oily for their entire life until you spray something over them like a fixative, or you put them behind glass. So they do stay workable. So I'm going to go in with some yellow and I'm going to make a sun. You could do this part with watercolor, but I just kind of wanted to show you a little bit more options with this medium. So I'm doing kind of a gradient, and I'm going to blend these together. So I'm doing white in the center, a lighter yellow, and then I'm going to build up to some darker colors. And remember, wherever I put my oil pastel, the watercolor will not go. So if I wanted some breaks in my oil pastel, maybe I won't blend that part out so that the watercolor can go in between. But I am going to blend these. So like where the black part is, you see how it's kind of gray, where I feathered the edges. The watercolor is going to be there, and that's going to add some transparency to that part. So almost like if you had like a feather and you looked in the distance, you would see whatever your background is behind the feather. And that's what I want here with my black reeds or grass, is I want the background to kind of show through a bit. So I'm going to blend this out with my trusty napkin. And you could use like an old t-shirt or something like that you cut up. I have a lot of those that I use for rags as well. But I find that tissue paper works really good. They do sell paper blenders, but I don't like using those for the pastels because they tend to get colored, and then you're smearing the colors around that are previously on there unless you clean it in some way. So I like the tissue paper because you can use it and use as many corners as you can and then toss it. You can also use your finger. Your fingers are great for blending oil pastels, but I figured for this tutorial I would try and work a little bit cleaner. Usually I just get oil pastels and have one finger for every color. I have my warm tone hand and my cool tone hand and my blacks and whites on my pinky. So I'm going in with the watercolor, and you'll see that my little pans are detachable. I just like to work in some water until I get the desired pigment. Again, you could test your pigment on the side on a small piece of paper if you're unsure of how much water to add, or you're unsure of what the color truly looks like when it's wet. You could test that out. So I went in with my chartreuse and I just did some lines directly under my sun, because under my sun is where it's going to be the brightest. And I kind of want that to reflect into the water. So I'm then going to go in with this teal turquoise color, and I'm going to draw my horizon line. And your horizon line is what is going to give this even more depth. Paintings can look very confusing if there's no horizon line, because the viewer doesn't know where to look. So I'm going to add my horizon line here just very gently with this, and I'm going to go in later with some mountains and some black and darken it up. I'm not going to go all the way across with my horizon line when I darken it, because I don't want it to be a solid split across my painting. If you divide your painting with a solid line all the way across with no breaks, it will flatten it and it will divide it and also be visually confusing. So put some breaks of color in your horizon line, or cross your horizon line. So like I have this grass going up past the horizon line, and that's going to break it up a bit as well. So you'll see when I'm going over this black pastel with my blue, it's not covering it. If I did this with acrylic paint, it would definitely cover it. And I actually have a video of covering crayon, but you could use oil pastels and making a scratch card, so you should check that one out as well. So I'm just going over and I'm adding water and not so much pigment. So you'll see me dunking into my water cup just off screen here, and I'm not actually picking up any more paint, and that's because I want darker and lighter areas. So darker, I'm going away from the sun, and lighter, I'm going towards the sun. So I'm going to grab another color here. So I have this like olive green, and that's just because I want to tone down the vibrancy that I have here, because I have that bright neon green, the chartreuse color, and then I have that brighter teal color, and I really want to warm it up, maybe make it a little bit more swampy, a little bit more green tint, because that's going to bring in the sun just a little bit more as well. Water typically isn't bright blue unless you're in the Bahamas. It always has a little bit of a green tinge to it. And you'll notice I'm not changing my brushes. I'm just rinsing it out in between colors, and I'm using the same brush. I'm using a flat brush today, and that's because I'm just doing some very simple watercolor techniques. I'm not doing any line work. I'm not doing anything fancy, but the square tip is going to allow me to get these finer lines in my painting without having to switch brushes. It also is going to help me cover a lot of area. So I'm going to go in with this brown, and I'm just going to make some little mountains, which I'm also going to darken up a little bit as well towards the bottom. I'm having my lighter elements be further away in the distance and my darker elements being silhouetted up front. So my mountains are going to be a little bit lighter, and then I'm going to have a little bit darker in front of those mountains to make them look even further away. Overlapping is a great way to create depth in a picture. So instead of having all of your elements standing separately in your painting, overlapping is going to make one look further away because it'll be behind the other one. So these are some just really simple painting techniques. You could go in and add some texture into your mountains. You could use gel pens and Sharpies and Fineliners and go in and add little pebbles and rocks, and maybe there's a little guy in a boat or something. I don't know. It's your little world, so you can make it how you want. And the sky, maybe it's nighttime where you're at, or maybe it's sunrise instead of a sunset. Maybe there's little birds in your sky. So you can take a landscape and make it your own as well. So I'm going in with my black, and I'm just cleaning up some of these reeds. With my oil pastel, I can only get such a fine point with them, so I like to go in with a little bit of black afterwards. Your black may bleed if your color underneath is not dry. I did my blue a while back before I did my brown on my mountains, so it's had some time to settle into the paper. If you are working on something that is not a thicker paper, like if you're working on printer paper or you're working on paper that is not absorbent, you would want to wait before adding your black, or it's going to bleed and make a mud puddle. So I'm just feathering out some details, and you can spend as much time as you want on this part. You could even go in and do some highlights in another color, or you could add highlights with another color of pastel as well. And maybe there's a little duck or something in your pond. So next I'm going in with this purple color, and I'm just adding a little bit more dimension into the water, a little bit darker. It's like a very cool purple, so it's more of a bluey purple. I'm going to go darker towards my horizon line and feather that down. You could also use this color for any shadows of, like if you had a boat, you would want a shadow with your darkest color underneath that boat just a little bit. Because the shadows do still go on water, so you definitely want to keep in mind of where your sun is and where your shadows are. Sometimes in my paintings, you have to imagine that there is just a really bright light off camera, especially in my digital paintings. I love intense bright light in my paintings, and sometimes the sun doesn't quite make up for that, or it's at night. You just have to imagine there's a really bright lantern or something. Who's to say there's not, right? So, but if you wanted it to be very accurate, you would want to make sure that your shadows follow your sun, or you indicate that there is another light source somewhere in your painting. So now I'm going with the sun, and again, I love the drama, so I'm going in with this very bold, it's like a fuchsia, but it's very warm, very, very close to an orangey pink color. It's not quite reading on camera as pink as it is. It does have quite a fuchsia undertone to it. And I am going to soften this fuchsia out with my oranges. So I'm laying it on thicker towards my horizon line. And then I am going to use water to soften it back out. And the motion I am going in is a little bit circular. I don't want any harsh lines. Down in my water, having the lines is great because it's going to emphasize that the water is rippling and all that. But in my sky, I want everything to be soft, light, and airy. And you can see I'm going over these reeds with no problem. They're not bleeding. I'm able to get up really close to them and get rid of any white lines around it. I find that when people are first starting out with oil pastels, they are hesitant to get close with the oil pastels because if you put two oil pastels next to each other, you can kind of blend them or bleed them together, like smush them together. So people tend to leave this like white line of like separating your peas and your corn on your plate or something. Like it's they can't touch for whatever reason, but the watercolor really helps you get right up next to that and fill it in. So if that's how you use oil pastels, then maybe afterwards you could go in with some watercolor to help blend your lines together a little bit. So I'm adding some cloud details. These breaks that I have up here are going to be blue so that I have a little bit of the sky peeking through this really intense sunset. And I'm going to come down into the water with a little bit of this orange because, again, we want to make sure that our light is reflective and it's matching what's happening in our sky. So if I had a little bird, I might want to have a little shadow underneath where that bird is. If I have clouds, I might want to reflect those in the water. If you're using a lot of intense blues, your water is not going to look as green as what I have here because the yellows that I have in my sunset are what are reflecting into that green. So I've noticed that some of my watercolor is just beading up on top of the oil pastel. Again, it's resisting, so I'm just daubing that off just so that there's no extra wetness that's going to, it's not going to hurt anything. I didn't want it there. All right, so I'm going in with a really intense blue, and I'm going to wash that out with my water and build it up, which is why watercolors are great, because you can build them up. And I'm going right up next to that orange, kind of fading it out into the orange a bit, adding a little bit of shadow around those clouds towards the top. And building up the intensity. And you're welcome to change it so that you're using a different brush that's smaller and you can get in more details if you're not comfortable working with such a large brush. This brush is about probably a quarter inch. It's a quarter inch brush I'm gonna go with. I haven't measured it, but if you had a larger piece of paper, you might want to use even a half inch or an inch brush to do these things. And then for your finer details, go in with a smaller one. This piece of paper is about half a standard sheet of paper. I don't remember the dimensions exactly. So I am going to go in and add a little bit more detail. And then when it's fully dry, I can go back in with some more oil pastels and I can add even more detail. You could go in with like a white gel pen and add details. My white gel pen is not working, and probably because I went over something that got jammed up in it. So sometimes that's just how it goes. So I'm going to go in with some oil pastels afterwards and add a little bit more highlight into the clouds. I'm going to add a little bit more highlight into the sun, maybe a little cloud over top. So that's what I'm doing here. Just adding some of those rays down into the water. And I'm going to add some highlights. just onto my clouds here. So it looks like the light is just intensely reflecting up onto it. And I'm going to break up the roundness of this just a little bit, and there's going to be a little bit of cloud going in front of my sun. And I'm being careful to not go over my black because my oil pastel will mix with the pastel that I have down already. Now, like I said before, the oil pastels don't dry down. They remain workable for their entire life unless you use a fixative. There are workable fixatives that are great. You could use a spray varnish or something like that, or just put it behind glass and not worry about it. So the option's up to you there. So I'm going to do a little bit cleaning up, and then I'm going to take a photo, and then I'm going to peel off this tape. So thank you for watching. I hope that you create your own landscape and that you enjoyed this video. I'm going to be doing some more oil pastels and watercolors and maybe a few other types of resist. So please like and subscribe so that you can see those videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.